In the structured forms hitherto considered, which are distinguished in general as consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit, religion, too, as consciousness of absolute being as such, has indeed made its appearance, although only from the standpoint of the consciousness that is conscious of absolute being. But absolute being in and for itself, the self-consciousness of spirit, has not yet appeared in those shapes. With paragraph 672, we are now starting a new section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. It is called Religion, and it occupies most of the paragraphs left in the work. The only other main section is the very short absolute knowing at the very end of the work, which brings everything to a conclusion. So you might ask yourself a number of different questions about this. Why is Hegel waiting until now to thematize religion? Why is this last section devoted to that? And what's its relationship with the philosophical enterprise, with absolute knowing, and with everything that happened before? Now, in this preliminary section of religion, before he starts getting into the dialectical advances and developments with natural religion, religion and art, and then the revealed religion, he's going to tell us a bit about its relation to the previous progressions. Here he calls them what Miller has translated as structured forms, Gestaltungen. So not just Gestalten, right? Not just shapes of consciousness, which he's going to talk about quite a bit in this preliminary section, but you could call these formations, right? Processes where we move from one Gestalt into another Gestalt, into another Gestalt. And we need to answer the question, well, why did we have to go through all this other stuff before getting to religion? And so here's part of the answer is being provided in this paragraph. He's going to distinguish religion from these other main, quite lengthy sections. He says, in the structured forms hitherto considered, so in all the rest of the work, right, a very large portion of it, which are distinguished in general, which are distinguished from each other in general, which we call in general consciousness, Bewusstsein, self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein, reason, Vernunft, and then spirit, Geist, right? Religion, too, as consciousness of absolute being as such, has indeed made its appearance. So he's telling us we've seen religion popping up in places in the stuff that we've been studying so far. Now, we should pause for a moment and look at what he tells us about religion. He's not defining it here at this point, but he is certainly characterizing it. Consciousness of absolute being. The being there is not Sein. The being there is Wesen, right? Which can also be translated as essence. And so, something that is essential, something that is important. It's also absolute, meaning that it is unrestricted. It is not relativized. It is not qualified. Although in the ways that we are going to see religion coming up, in the determinate shapes that it occupies, it is not going to be absolute, although its object will be absolute in that way. So he tells us, right, that religion has made its appearance, but only from the standpoint of the consciousness that is conscious of absolute being, absolute, Wesen in this case. So what does that mean for what was going on within these structured forms? More was going on than we were realizing as we were making our way through those progressions. And this is, a bit of a side note, and it's in some ways a side note about side passages. going through Hegel's dialectic, there's always more going on at any given moment than meets the eye or meets the eye of the reader in going through the text. Our attention is focused on one thing, and there's other developments happening. Sometimes those feed into the developing dialectic as we go down the path. Sometimes they just, get brought up and they don't get followed out. Or they do much later on. They reemerge. And each of the processes so far, consciousness feeding into self-consciousness, which is a new progression, feeding into reason, which is yet a newer and much longer and more robust and concrete progression, reason feeding into spirit, which is even longer, more robust, more complex, more concrete, right? All concrete, is a rather relative term when we're talking about Hegel, we should point out, because a lot of this may have seemed very abstract to you when we were going through it. But each of these had moments where something wasn't quite realized, but could have been referenced. So Hegel's talking about this here. He tells us that absolute being, in and for itself, the self-consciousness of spirit, has not appeared in those shapes. It has not appeared in those progressions. Now, that's kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? Because we just saw at the very end of Spirit that Spirit was aware of itself in this sense, and that's how God entered into the picture. Well, right, but then now we're transitioning to religion. So we can ask ourselves, is Hegel being completely accurate in his assessment of what he's gone through at this point? And the answer is probably no. But because we've certainly had a glimpse, you could say, of absolute being in and for itself as the self-consciousness of spirit. Spirit has been using us and the previous people throughout all these developments in order to develop itself, to get consciousness of itself. And so we've certainly had some glimpses. We haven't ever grasped absolute being in and for itself in any of these things. And I should point out, by the way, for those people who are like, Hegel is primarily about the master-slave dialectic, that's way back here. And that is a rudimentary shape of consciousness, even in the self-consciousness thing. It's definitely not grasping the totality of things. That is not the master key for understanding Hegel, any more than force in the understanding is in consciousness, any more than all the interesting things happening in reason or spirit are. None of those are the single hermeneutic for grasping Hegel. If anything, religion is going to provide that hermeneutic. Before we go on and look at the passages yet to come that flesh out this progression and this idea about what's going on with religion, there's two things we really need to mention. You notice that I'm drawing arrows from religion to spirit, reason, self-consciousness, and consciousness, and that some of the arrows are dotted arrows. Why did I do that? To graphically represent something about where we're headed. The consciousness section, it has a connection to religion. It has a connection, you can say, to absolute being in and for itself. It doesn't do so in a way that is religious. And so you could say the object is being gestured at or pursued, but it's not being pursued in the modality, in the form, right, of religion. Self-consciousness, the self-consciousness section, as Hegel's going to point out in just a minute in another paragraph, that actually does have a lot of discussion of religion, of actual religious practice on the part of people and theorizing about it in the unhappy consciousness. You could even say that it's implicit there in the Stoicism section, although Hegel doesn't really draw that out. Reason, same thing. Reason does not really have much to say by way of human religions. Spirit, if you've been paying attention, spirit did. So that's an important point. The last thing I want to say before jumping into the next paragraphs is it is a legitimate question. Why is Hegel bringing up religion in a thematic way now? So this is a bigger, broader issue within Hegel's thought. Hegel thinks that religion and philosophy have a similar ground, but approach the objects that they're working with in different modes. So religion is particularly focused, when it's doing its job well, on what he calls picture thinking, Vorstellung, right? Representation is another translation of it. Whereas genuine philosophy, when it's not merely a philosophy of the understanding, as he criticizes, for example, Locke as being, but it becomes a philosophy of the concept, or as what Miller translates as the notion, the Begriff, right? And so it's begriffliche, conceptual, in a way that is different than what other people have called concepts in the past, or ideas, or whatever. And philosophy and religion, therefore, they not only share a lot of the same ground. Religion is something that allows world spirit in its concrete forms to develop certain ways of thinking, which then religion can pass off to philosophy. And this is what, in an article I've actually called the Second Enlightenment. Hegel is kind of down on what we typically call the Enlightenment because it made mistakes in relation to religion, threw out a lot of baby with the bathwater, right? And he's also proposing something like a philosophizing of religion, a taking religious concepts and transforming them into something more genuinely universal, more genuinely self-aware, and therefore transforming religion in the process, as we're going to see happening in particular in the Revealed Religion section. So that's all by way of preamble about where we're going with this section. Even consciousness, insofar as it is in the understanding, is consciousness of the supersensible or the inner side of objective existence. But the supersensible, the eternal or whatever else it may be called, is devoid of self. It is only, to begin with, the universal, which is a long way yet from being spirit, that knows itself as spirit. Then there was the self-consciousness that reached its final shape in the unhappy consciousness. That was only the pain of the spirit that wrestled, but without success, to reach out into objectivity. The unity of the individual self-consciousness and its changeless essence to which the former attains remains, therefore, a beyond for self-consciousness. The immediate existence of reason, which for us issued from that pain, and its peculiar shapes have no religion, because the self-consciousness of them knows or seeks itself in the immediate present. In paragraph 673, Hegel is going to talk about the first three main courses or progressions within the phenomenology, and whether we attain to understanding religion. Religion, remember, too, is a human orientation towards absolute being or absolute essence that is in some way conscious of itself as doing so. Did we actually attain to that in any of these sections? And let's actually start by talking about the one that he considers third, reason. He says the immediate existence of reason, which for us issued from that pain, the pain of the unhappy consciousness, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and its peculiar shapes, its particular Gestalten, right, have no religion, because the self-consciousness of them knows or seeks itself in the immediate present, Gegenwart. What is there for it? And this Gegen is going to be kind of important here in just a minute, as we're going to see. So the whole reason section, as he says, has no religion. We should remind ourselves of what that reason section, the second longest in the work, actually comprised. So when you look at the table of contents, we start out with the certainty and truth of reason, issuing after the self-consciousness section. And here Hegel distinguishes what he means from idealism, from other forms of idealism. And then he turns immediately to observing reason. And observing reason, it doesn't really need religion. As a matter of fact, religion could be kind of a handicap because it wants to look at the world and figure out how things actually work. And it is going to be approaching what Hegel is calling the supersensible or the inner side of objective existence. But it's approaching it as something that we, the human subject, can know and delve into and grasp for ourselves and then communicate about and have science of, Wissenschaft, right? So he's got all this stuff about, biological organisms and the organic and things like that. This is also the part where we have his critique of logical and psychological laws and the pseudosciences of physiognomy and phrenology. None of that has anything to do with religion. And then he moves on, and this is, for me, the stuff that's really interesting in the reason section. The section following that is the actualization of rational self-consciousness through its own activity. There, he's talking about essentially ethics in a broad sense, right? What motivates the human being? What gives its life meaning? And he talks about the Sache selbst in that whole passage, that whole progression. The thing, it's no longer just the thing in itself, it's what preoccupies us, where we find our good. And he's got pleasure of necessity, the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit, virtue in the way of the world. And although virtue may be talked about by religion, you don't have to think of things in a religious way at all in that section. Then we have the third section of reason. Individuality, which takes itself to be real in and for itself. And he's got this whole discussion of what he calls the spiritual animal kingdom and deceit, the matter in hand itself, and then these two things that are clearly connected with Kant in some way, but also with other philosophers. Reason as lawgiver, reason as testing laws. No need to talk about religion in any of that, right? So the reason section is not one that we're particularly worried about thematically as giving us content that is religion, although we're going to see that we're not leaving reason totally behind. It's still important in relation to these other sections. Now let's look at the other two, where there's at least some content, Hegel says. So we come back to the beginning of the paragraph. Even consciousness, insofar as it is the understanding, is consciousness of the supersensible or inner side of objective existence. So consciousness had three sections. Sense certainty. We begin from what seems to be most simple, most immediate, most straightforward. We find out it's actually quite complex, and that we can't even identify the here and now or then and there very easily. And then we move into perception, and there it's about the understanding coming into play, but also essences and deception going on, and we talk about the thing and its properties. Then we get to this probably the most challenging part of the phenomenology, I would say, from my experience and from what people tell me about their own readings, force and the understanding, where we've got a number of different things coming in, the concept of force and forces in relation to each other, the human understanding as grasping those forces, the concept of laws that are making sense of those forces and are able to be understood by the understanding, and even a set of worlds, including an inverted world, but there's really three worlds there, that all connect up together and give us the world that we know and can experience. So here Hegel talks about the supersensible, or inner side. Now, supersensible, we're tempted to read that if we didn't have that inner side as the supernatural, the transcendent, what it is that's above us. But Hegel's got his finger on the right thing here. It's not just what transcends us, it's what is immanent within our experience, but we're not attending to. Because we focus too much on, the concepts, not real concepts in the Hegelian sense, but the ideas, the essences, the things that we encounter, and we don't really think about their true significance and how they're bound together in something greater than them, which our minds can grasp. The inner side of objective, gegenständliche existence, Dasein, right? And so this is important, and this is tying in with what religion is interested in. It's not framed in a religious way in Force and the Understanding, but there's also a problem there as well, according to Hegel. He says that the supersensible, the eternal, the ewige, right, or whatever else it may be called, is devoid of self. It is only to begin with the universal, which is a long way yet from being spirit, that knows itself as spirit. Now, it is spirit, right, because everything is spirit. But it's not spirit that knows itself as spirit. It's intellect or understanding, grasping forces, grasping laws, grasping the world, grasping its own role in doing so, which is all really cool stuff, but it's not yet spirit grasping itself. And what it's grasping is, as he says, devoid of self. It may be dynamic, but it doesn't have a self. It doesn't have subjectivity. It doesn't exercise intentional agency, which is what spirit will be doing. That's part of what it is when we talk about there being a God to engage with, to worship, to be connected with. Seems a little bit more promising when we look at what we got out of self-consciousness, doesn't it? So Hegel goes on and he tells us, then there was the self-consciousness that reached its final shape, Gestalt, right, in the unhappy consciousness, which was a long section in the self-consciousness portion, right? We had that first thing about life and self-consciousness, and they encounter each other, and self-consciousness exists only through another self-consciousness. You're all familiar with that shtick at this point. Then we had the very short master-slave dialectic. Then we had the longer Stoicism and skepticism sections, which are attempts to try to figure things out, to make sense of the social world that we're in. They go beyond the master-slave dialectic, but they don't totally escape the problematic. And then we have the much longer unhappy consciousness, which is where self-consciousness ends, right? And so self-consciousness, the whole section doesn't end with me related to you and us struggling to understand each other. It ends with me and you trying to understand God, trying to understand the eternal, trying to understand the divine, trying to understand that which is essential, in relation to which we are non-essential, we are less important, we are mere worms, to use one phrase at a certain point. So he talks about the pain of spirit, the Schmerz des Geistes, right? This sadness, this problematic that we're running into. And he tells us that in this, we have the pain of the spirit that wrestled to reach out into objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit. So now notice we have objective existence, Gegenständliche Dasein, right? We have objectivity itself, Gegenständlichkeit, being objective, the state of being able to be grasped as an object. The subject is trying to grasp God in that way, and that's why it has all the smells and bells, the incense prayers. All these are attempts to reach the God who is beyond. He tells us that it's without success, nicht erreichende, right? Not attaining what it is attempting to do. It does advance spirit in the process, because even by not attaining it, it does attain certain shapes which just are not adequate to it. And so Hegel will tell us that the unity of the individual self-consciousness and its changeless essence, to which the former attains, remains therefore a beyond for self-consciousness. Now, remains a beyond. It already was a beyond that was trying to be brought into objectivity by the worshiper, by the person who's trying to connect themselves with God. God is already jenseits, on the other side, beyond us, and we reach towards God, and God goes even further away. We attain to a spot, and we're like, finally, I've got it. And then that's not God. We're not getting what we're ultimately seeking. This, by the way, this concept of human beings projecting part of themselves that they don't recognize as themselves, out there onto God or whatever the religious object is as something that is then accorded absolute value and you keep trying to reach. That is the interpretation of religion by the great Hegelian Feuerbach, right? Hegel is going to himself think that we can move past at least that conception of religion that we're getting in the unhappy consciousness, right? So we want to find a way to unify the individual self-consciousness and changeless essence in religion. So what he's done for us in this paragraph is told us why we didn't get to religion as religion in these first three important portions of the work, which comprise about half of the work, right? On the other hand, in the ethical world, we did see a religion, namely the religion of the underworld. It is the belief in the terrible, unknown night of fate and in the humanities of the departed spirit. The former is pure negativity in the form of universality. The latter is the same negativity in the form of individuality. Absolute being is, in the latter form, indeed the self and present, since other than present the self cannot be. But the individual self is this individual shade which is separated from itself, the universality which fate is. True, it is a shade, a superseded particular self, and thus a universal self. But the negative significance of the shade has still not changed round into the positive significance of the universal self, and therefore the superseded self still has, at the same time, the immediate significance of this particular and essenceless being. But fate, devoid of self, remains the unconscious night, which does not attain to an immanent differentiation, nor to the clarity of self-knowledge. Paragraph 674 continues the discussion, the examination of the degree to which religion, in the sense that Hegel is developing it in this second to last section of the Phenomenology, has been involved in the four previous parts, and this one focuses on the spirit portion that we've just concluded. And it's looking at the first part of the spirit section. So we're not looking at morality, which is the part that we just finished up with. We're also not looking at culture, which is going to have some discussion about religion, particularly in terms of faith or belief, Glaube. Instead, Hegel is concentrating on the discussion within the ethical order. You may remember that he brought up the particular case which he's developing into something a bit broader, of the Antigone and the battle between the various children of Oedipus. So he's drawing some greater conclusions about that in that section. In the ethical order section, we have a lot going on. And if we look at the actual titles, right, we have the true spirit, the ethical order. This is coming after the reason section, which Hegel has just told us didn't have religion at all. The ethical world, human and divine law, man and woman is the first part. So human and divine law is the key part there. Well, if you've got divine law, you've got religion, right? Well, yes. Yes, to a certain degree, as we're going to see. The second part is ethical action, human and divine knowledge, guilt and destiny, or fate, right? And then the third part, legal status. Now, the third part, legal status, where we have a lord of the world, which is, actually referencing the unhappy consciousness section in that section, and the Stoicism and Skepticism sections as well. Hegel doesn't talk about that at all. Instead, he focuses on these two sections. So if there's divine knowledge, there's got to be some engagement with God, right? Well, yes and no. What does Hegel have to say here? He tells us that in the ethical world, we did see a religion, the religion of the underworld. It is the belief in the terrible, unknown night of faith and in the humanities of the departed spirit. So let's pause on that for just a moment. there are different aspects of ancient Greek religion, which he's taking as characteristic here, which is typical Hegel, right? The Greeks are sort of like the embodiment of Western rationality, which is the embodiment of rationality as such, the development of spirit. So, and the Romans take a lot of stuff from the Greeks, so even when Hegel moves from the Greeks to the Romans, there's still this aspect there of, we need to focus on what the Greeks were doing. So the Greeks had, the pantheon of the Olympian gods who had displaced the Titans, and, there's a belief in the Hadean underworld and all that sort of stuff. And then there's this other aspect of Greek religion, and we're not just talking about, say, like the mystery religions. We're also talking about something that's practiced within the home and acknowledged as important within the city, but there's always a rivalry between the city's laws and the divine laws, as we've seen, like, again, in the Antigone. So the Greeks believed in what we can call the Chthonian gods, those who very often you're not praying to because you want them to help you out or their ideals. You actually want to keep them away, and you want to appease them and satisfy them, and you do things in the dark, and you do things out of motives for them. So this is what we're talking about here, right? And he brings up fate, and he brings up the humanities of the departed spirit. Now, interestingly, the spirit here is not just a shade, as he's going to talk about, Shata in just a bit, shadow, but a spirit, a Geist. He's using the word Geist there. So we'd think, okay, that's great. We've got the development of spirit. And what does he mean by humanities? Well, these are what we called other things, to euphemize them, We don't want to speak ill of the dead, they say, right? So why not? Well, because maybe the dead are listening, and they don't like the way we talk about them. So we have to propitiate them. So he goes on and he says, this is religion, right? But what kind of religion do we have? Well, let's think about these objects of the religion. The former, fate, is pure negativity in the form of universality. So it is universal, but it's a kind of negativity, he says. The latter is the same negativity in the form of individuality. Absolute being, he says, in the latter form, that is, in the departed dead, is in the latter form, indeed the self and present, since other than present the self cannot be. So the dead are with us. The dead are acknowledged by us, right? But how are they? He says, the individual self is this individual shade, shadow, which is separated from itself, the universality which fate is. Right? So we got two different kinds of universality going on here. As he's going to tell us, true, it's a shade, a superseded, aufgehobenes. So it's been transcended, particular self, and thus a universal self. So pause on this for a moment. When people die, we allow them to live in our hearts, as we say, but it's a memory of them, or it's a reconstruction of them, or an idealization of them. It's not them as a acting living subject. It's them as a universal subject, but as a sublated or an overcome subject. So he goes on and he says, the negative significance of the shade has not still changed round into the positive significance of the universal self. That's what we're looking for. So the superseded self still has, at the same time, the immediate significance of this particular and essenceless being. But fate devoid of self remains the unconscious night which does not attain to an imminent differentiation. So, neither side is really satisfying for what we're looking for religion. The departed spirit, the sacred dead, they have not changed into the positive significance of the universal self. They have the immediate significance of this particular and essenceless being. When we walk through somebody else's graveyard, there's a sense in which we don't care, unless we, are worried about, like zombies arising or the evil dead or whatever it's going to be, all that sort of silly supernatural, just for entertaining ourselves, fantasies that we bring up. In a certain sense, the dead only matter to those who continue to remember them, at least in this particular way that Hegel is thinking about it. There are, in fact, plenty of cultures in which the ancestors have a much more robust capacity to be involved, but that's not what he's talking about here. What about fate? Fate is devoid of self. There isn't any self there. There's really almost no self on the part of the departed spirit. There's no self in fate. It's just what it is. So it's, as he calls it, the unconscious night which does not attain to an imminent differentiation nor to the clarity of self-knowledge. How could fate attain to the clarity of self-knowledge? It doesn't even have an intellect. It doesn't have anything to it. It just is what it is and unfolds the way it does. So this is not getting us religion in the sense that we're developing it in this section. It does have, all sorts of implications for how the ancients and perhaps many other people, even perhaps in the present, do view religious objects. But for Hegel, these are kind of deficient and defective, inadequate to what religion really is for us human beings.